Well, it's government's job to pass laws, it's police's job to enforce them. I note some politicians are attempting to direct police on the way that they should act. But what police should do is enforce the law. The laws are there about hate symbols. The Hezbollah flag is quite clearly a hate symbol and should not be displayed here in Australia.
The flag of the listed terrorist organisation Hezbollah, and whether it should be against the law to fly it in Australia, has become the latest flashpoint in the domestic debate over the worsening crisis in the Middle East. The flag was flown at rallies in Sydney and Melbourne on Sunday, which were in response to Israel's assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. The Prime Minister, as we heard, agrees the flag should not be displayed in Australia. And police in New South Wales have now charged a 19-year-old woman who allegedly flew the flag at the rally in Sydney using laws, hate symbol laws, that were passed by the federal parliament at the end of last year. The opposition leader reckons there should have been a much more swift response to this, immediate arrests made. And if there's any doubt about how this law operates, that should be cleared up, amendments made. These laws, though, are yet to be tested. But not everyone thinks that criminalising the display of symbols like the Hezbollah flag is a good idea. And I'm keen to explore why there's a concern about this law and whether a better approach might be more effective. I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, the Law Council of Australia has raised some concerns about this law. That was before it was passed back in December of last year. Greg McIntyre is the president of the Law Council. He's actually in London at the moment and joins us now. Greg McIntyre, SC, welcome to you.
Morning, David.
So tell me what your concern is and the concern of the Law Council is about this law.
Well, the police have quite a difficult decision to make as to whether displaying a particular flag fits within the law as it presently is, which prohibits knowingly displaying a prohibited terrorist organisational symbol. Whether or not that flag by itself comprises a breach of that legislation is a difficult judgment call. It requires a reasonable person to believe that it was advocating hatred of a targeted group or in an attempt to offend, and there's a public interest defence. So an attempt to offend, insult, humiliate, intimidate, use force. That's
so
the
we'll get to the law itself and the problems with it, but you're saying the way the law is currently written, just flying the flag is not necessarily a criminal act.
Well, it may not be. I mean, it'll depend upon the circumstances, and I hear that the police have gone ahead and charged a particular person. We don't know the precise circumstances which caused them to believe that it might fit within that concept. Presumably they've formed a view that it does, and that will probably be tested.
So they'd need to be able to prove to the judgment of a reasonable person, as you point out, that there is not just the flying of the flag, but some intention behind it. Is that the best way of describing it?
It needs to involve advocacy of hatred, and it needs to be not in the public interest to do so. This is a very complex factual situation we have here, and making the judgment call as to whether all of those ingredients are there without an obvious defence is a call that the officer in charge has to make and determine whether to proceed.
All right, well, we'll see where that ends up going in the court system. But what is your concern with the actual law itself, the legislation as it's written?
We're quite concerned about its proportionality because in a democratic society, we do believe in freedom of speech and the ability to have different points of view and to express those points of view. And there are a lot of concepts there which I've mentioned which have varying meanings to different people. And so there are tricky issues which ultimately probably a judge will have to decide as to where a particular activity of an individual falls above or below that line.
But doesn't flying, whether it's a Nazi flag, a Hezbollah flag, given it's a listed terrorist organisation, Why do you think that perhaps should not be against the law? How is that the sort of expression that we want to allow to be legal?
Well, it may be against the law, provided it has those other ingredients. That is, that it's advocating hatred, that it's targeting a group based on race, religion, or nationality. So you need to find all of those factors to determine that it's something which ought to be curtailed.
But is there fundamentally, do you think, a problem in trying to criminalise this sort of expression?
Well, it clearly cruels free expression. We do accept that there do have to be some limits on freedom of expression. That people can't be inappropriately damaged by that kind of conduct. So it's quite a complicated balancing exercise, and it's at its most intense in the situation the world is at present.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, has the October 7 attacks and everything we've seen over the past 12 months shifted the view of the Law Council on this legislation, or do you maintain those concerns that this isn't the best way to tackle radicalisation?
No, we don't say that the legislation shouldn't exist. We say that probably we ought to be attacking it in a community educative role first. I mean, if we could possibly become involved in educating the types of person who might become radicalised and take a view which does advocate hatred, we ought to be taking preventative measures. Ultimately, if those preventative measures are not working, then clearly sanctions need to be applied. But they need to be applied carefully, with not just picking up everybody who might be displaying a particular flag. I mean, flags obviously have particular symbolism. I don't know that this particular flag in this instance has been declared to be part of a display of something which involves a terrorist organisation. Perhaps it has. If that's the case, then it may fall within the legislation.
Well, I think the Prime Minister referred to the flag having a gun on it as well, that it was a violent symbol, and Hezbollah, of course, as a terrorist organisation, that is spreading hate and a violent message as well.
Perhaps if all of those ingredients line up, then it may be appropriate to proceed with charges of that kind.
Okay, but you're saying the emphasis really needs to be on early intervention. Is there evidence to suggest that is going to do a better job of tackling radicalisation than criminalising the flying of a flag?
There are groups who do that. I mean, members of the different ethnic groups involved in this conflict have certainly been attempting to do that. Clearly, it's difficult to identify every person who might be inclined to be radicalised, but clearly those who are part of some of the religious and national and racial groups who are involved clearly do not foster terrorism and are seeking to educate their local communities to avoid it.
We've also seen a bit of a debate about whether Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, has suggested that the Attorney-General should have made clear to the Federal Police Commissioner and the ASIO boss that this was not to be tolerated. He's been accused by the Prime Minister of somehow endangering the separation of powers here, that we need to let police do their job. What do you think about this? Is there a role for government to, after a law is passed, say to the police, here's an example of where we think arrests should be made?
There is a role for government, and particularly the Attorney-General, in giving directions to the Australian Federal Police as to matters of general policy. That doesn't descend to giving particular directions as to who should be arrested and in what circumstances. That's a matter which, in our separation of powers, is a role for the designated police officer in charge, or whether the Director of Public Prosecutions, if it comes to a hearing, to make a decision as to whether to prosecute. Those are matters which we in our democracy say is not a matter for political decision. It's a matter for the designated decision makers. And so
yeah, with who should be arrested and so on. But what about saying to the police? What about saying to the police, this flag we think is a problem, and this is something, if displayed, we believe is a breach of this law?
I mean, the statute creates the terms, and ultimately that will be a matter for the judiciary to decide whether what has happened is consistent with what the Parliament has legislated. So the Parliament has legislated as to what is unlawful. It's really not then. The Attorney General or the government doesn't have an additional role in describing what is unlawful. They've sat in the Parliament and enacted the legislation along with the opposition and the crossbenchers to decide where the line will be drawn. It then goes really to, firstly, the police to decide whether to prosecute, and then the judiciary to decide whether the law has in fact been infringed.
So any suggestion from an Attorney General that this flag should be acted on would be overstepping the mark?
I think that's right. Obviously, the police have to make a decision based, in this sort of instance, on a public perception, if you like. I mean, I suppose all points of view would be taken into account in deciding, as a matter of public perception, whether it breaches the law. But it ought not to be seen that one arm of government is pressurising or putting pressure on the other arm of government to perform their function. They need to be able to act independently in accordance with the law as the enforcers see it.
Bottom line, does this involve for police and ultimately the courts a fair bit of judgment, essentially, that it's not, black and white prescribed in the law what they should and shouldn't be doing? Does this put a lot of that judgment and reading community or public sentiment, as you put it, in the hands of the police and the courts?
Yes, it does, and that's where we've decided in our democratic institutions to place it.
Is that the right thing to do in this regard?
I think it is. I mean, the Parliament can intervene and amend legislation if it doesn't think that what it provided in the legislation it's created so far is doing what they believe is in the public interest, so that role can be played. But it's not a matter of then short-circuiting that and, if you like, the Attorney General amending the law by press release or direction.
Would it be helpful to have this law amended to give it more clarity, to say, if you just are flying the flag, and if it's this flag, then that's going to be a criminal offence?
I'm not sure that that's going to be possible. I mean, it's quite difficult to pin it down to specific fact situations. That's really what the role of the courts are, that the legislature creates terms and provides words, and then the courts need to determine what those words mean in the particular fact situation.
This law is going to be tested, no doubt. Do you think it would stand up to a High Court challenge ultimately?
Yes. I mean, the High Court will, if asked, if it gets to the High Court, will need to look at the question of the proportionality of the legislation as against the implied freedom of political communication, which it has developed as part of our implied constitutional law. So it may be that a case will get to the High Court for them to, again, apply their wisdom to that balancing exercise.
Ultimately, and finally, is this good law? I don't know if you can contrast it to what other jurisdictions, other countries have done in relation to hate symbols, but is this good law in Australia?
It's necessary law. Whether the legislature have got it exactly right will be determined as the courts develop it. The courts, of course, will look at how to interpret ambiguous words or words which might have more than one meaning, looking at broad, fundamental international human rights standards as to how you interpret words of that kind.
We will see where that goes. Greg McIntyre, the President of the Law Council of Australia, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
If you have any thoughts on this conversation or ideas for further podcasts, do drop us a line, insiders@abc.net.au. We'll be discussing all of this Sunday morning on The Couch. Hope to see you then.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.